Today's COVID update is brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price but stay for the service.
And welcome back. As we mentioned prior to the commercial break, our first conversation this morning will be with the Minister of Education, Culture, Science and Technology, the Honorable Francis Fonseca, where we'll be discussing the budget consultations. We'll also be discussing other points of interest in the Minister's portfolio as it relates to education and the reopening of schools. That being said, good morning, Minister Fonseca.
Hi, good morning, Marlene, and good morning, Isani. It's a great pleasure to, as always, it's a great pleasure to join you on Open Your Eyes this morning.
Let's begin with the budget consultations. I know that you guys have been making your rounds, meeting with various stakeholders to get their perspective and, of course, their feedback in terms of putting together what will be the fiscal budget for 2021. Let's begin there. What has that been like in terms of being able to meet with the various interested parties?
Right. Yeah, you're exactly right, Isani. The cabinet appointed a team of ministers, which included myself, the Deputy Prime Minister, Cordell Hyde, and the Minister of the Public Service and Constitutional and Political Reform, Henry Charles Usher, to hold consultations with the unions on the budget for fiscal year 2021-22, but also to present to them a fiscal and economic performance review of fiscal year 2020-21. Because I think, as the nation now knows very clearly, we are faced with a very serious financial crisis coming out of fiscal year 2021, where we have a shortfall, a financing gap of close to $500 million. So in light of that context, and in preparation for the new budget, we had to sit down and talk with the unions because some tough decisions have to be made about how together we can work together to really solve that issue facing us, facing the country. How do we close that gap in an equitable way? So over the last 2 weeks or so, our team has met with the National Trade Union Congress of Belize, which, as you know, is the umbrella organization for the trade unions. We've met with the Public Service Union. We've met with the Belize National Teachers Union, of course. And we've also met with the Association of Public Service Senior Managers. Now, under the umbrella of the NTUCB, we also met with the Christian Workers Union, the UB Faculty and Staff Union, and the Belize Communication Workers Union. So we feel that we've had a very comprehensive discussion with all of the unions in Belize. And the objective really was, as I said, to meet with them, to share with them in a very frank, honest, and open way the state of the economy, the state of affairs, the state of financial affairs in our country. And to discuss with them how can we together develop a homegrown plan, an equitable homegrown plan, a sustainable, credible, practical homegrown plan for financial recovery, for economic recovery, because that is where we all want to go. No. So that conversation, I know everybody talks about the wage bill, and of course that is the elephant in the room, because the wage bill, as everyone knows, accounts for the great majority of government expenditure. I think as people have become very familiar now with the fact that I think 83 cents of every dollar that the government spends, that the government takes in, is spent on wages, bills, and pensions, the wage bill and pensions. So that's something we have to tackle. But I want to make very clear that our discussions with the unions were very comprehensive. We talked also about revenue enhancement measures, what can government do? What policies can we enact? What recommendations can you make for how we can enhance revenues? Keeping in mind that we are in a very delicate situation. The private sector is already heavily burdened. They themselves, in fact, have laid off a lot of people. So practical revenue enhancement measures, we had a discussion about that. We also talked about debt restructuring. The government is engaged in a comprehensive debt restructuring exercise. A debt management team is working on that. A dedicated debt management team is focused on that issue. How can we restructure the debt, particularly our external debt, to get a significant haircut, to provide breathing space, to provide breathing room for the Belizean economy so that we can recover. So debt restructuring was also a part of the discussion. We talked about capital projects. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask the question before we move ahead too far. I think it's interesting when you say that the wage cuts is this elephant in the room. And I think that lends to the question very clearly, why wasn't there a preliminary discussion to explore with the unions their viewpoint and where there were opportunities for compromise before creating what would be your first proposal?
Oh no, absolutely. That's the point. Indeed, we did have as I said, a comprehensive discussion. The real question, Marlene, is why did this not take place a year ago? This really should have taken place a year ago, and any responsible government would have had this conversation with the public service. In fact, we saw the opposite. So there was no serious conversation. So immediately upon taking office after November 11th, we began that sort of discussion. But we had to, of course, you will understand and appreciate that we had to first get a proper handle on the fiscal situation ourselves. So we did a lot of work. The Ministry of Finance did a lot of work preparing for these consultations, making sure that in fact we had the correct figures. And in fact, I can tell you the Ministry of Finance had to do this exercise several times to make sure that in fact what we were presenting to the unions and to, as you know, there's a team as well meeting with the private sector and the NGO community, that in fact we were presenting real figures to them. So that took some time. But the purpose of the discussions, and certainly our consultations are ongoing. Our consultations are not done. Our consultations are ongoing. The initial consultation, the purpose was in fact to do that, to present to them the lay of the land. This is the fiscal and economic situation facing the country as we go into this new budget year. What are your recommendations? What would you like to see done? And that is why I'm talking about these different areas, because they had, of course, we had a discussion, as I said, about revenue enhancement measures. We had a discussion about debt restructuring. We had a discussion about capital projects. How can government streamline capital projects, for example?
Let me interject quickly here, Minister. I get the impression that this was all done or set against the backdrop of austerity and belt tightening, considering the present economic state of affairs. Is that so?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the fiscal and economic review that we have presented, and I think it's been made public now, shows very clearly that we're faced with a dire financial situation. I mean, we have, when you talk about unemployment and underemployment, we're talking about over 65% of the population being either unemployed, 30% unemployed, and another 35 to 38% being underemployed. That is absolutely significant. The debt to GDP ratio, I think Belizean people are becoming very familiar with these terms now, is around 134%, the highest debt to GDP ratio in the Caribbean and Central America. This is unsustainable, unsustainable. And if we do not fix this problem, if we do not address this problem, then we are headed down a very dangerous path where we are at risk losing our fiscal sovereignty, abandoning our fiscal sovereignty to the IMF and the IFIs. And I don't think any Belizeans want us to travel down that road, because you know what the result of that is.
Now, having discussed extensively with all of these social partners, what would you say would have been the primary concern or the collective issue that they all flagged in terms of either certain considerations that ought to be made by the government or certain sacrifices, if I may, that they should be making going into the new financial calendar?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to make it abundantly clear that, our team was very, very impressed with all of the unions that we met with, the public officers, the senior managers, the teachers, union representatives. We firmly believe that they came to the table in absolute good faith. They're very sincere, in my view, in their commitment to working with the government to find a credible solution to the crisis we're facing. They're very aware of the crisis, particularly the public officers who are a part of the government service, and they have, they see these things every day. They see these figures every day. So they want, I believe, to find a solution. They want to find a homegrown, equitable solution, but that is the key word for them, equitable. They believe if we're going to have a burden placed on the Belizean people, if you like, on public officers or teachers or other individuals, that burden should be equitable, that it should be shared in a very equitable manner. And of course, they are always concerned about waste. They're concerned about abuse. They're concerned about corruption. So those are critical issues for them. So they want to ensure that before we have a discussion about any burden being placed on public officers or teachers in terms of any wage issue, that we have exhausted every other option. As I said, that we have explored the issue of revenue enhancement measures, that we have looked at the debt and restructured it in a proper way, that we have streamlined our capital projects and put an end to these bloated public contracts, that we have looked very carefully at goods and services that the government provides and buys, and that in fact those have been slimmed down, trimmed down in an efficient manner, that there's no longer waste taking place. And then we can look at the issue of wages. So I think that's a very reasonable position that they've adopted.
Okay. And, when you talk about equitable, let's look into some of the concerns that people have when they talk about wage cuts. And I just want to get your perspective. I know there's no formal government position as yet. As we know, currently, ministers are being asked to take a 10% pay cut, which is an interesting precedent to set if you go into any consideration about wage cuts in the future with public service. But there's also the bigger concern of looking at whether or not it's seen to be a one-size-fits-all approach. In other words, there are teachers who earn far less than others who work within the ministry. It's the same for public service. You have entry-level public servants versus senior management public service. Is there going to be, if we move in the direction of wage cuts at all, a real consideration for what is the reality for workers and what they have in their pocket already and what you'll be taking away?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we can all agree that one size fits all is not the appropriate approach to take in respect of any burden sharing. It has to be equitable, as you rightly said, and those who can most handle a cut would certainly, if that decision were taken, would be asked to take a greater share of that burden. And those at the lower end of the wage bill, at the wage pool, would certainly, we would have to, of course, appreciate their position, their economic position, their fragile state that they're in. So you're absolutely right. It cannot be one size fits all. And I think, as I said, that is very, very important to the unions. That has been brought up consistently as it relates to our discussions with them. But
what are some of the responses coming from the unions on the issue of revenue collection and generation? What was their take on that?
Yeah, I think the unions were, as I said, very sincere, and they recognized. I mean, they live in Belize. They have friends in the private sector who have been laid off. They see their family members who work in the tourism sector out of work for 10 months. So they understand, I think, and appreciate that the private sector is taking a licking. And they understand that 25% of the unemployment is made up of people who earn a living in the tourism sector. So they appreciate that, and they understand that many people have been laid off, and so I think they want a proper balance. They understand that, listen, the private sector is already being taxed heavily. They are already seeing significant losses in terms of revenue in the private sector because of the lockdowns that we have experienced. So their only request in that regard was, listen, let's look at everything. Let's look at where we can close loopholes, where there are concessions, that type of thing, where duty exemptions were being made available. How can we look at those issues to ensure that there is no waste, there's no abuse? Those were two words that came up quite regularly. They, and the unions were very open. They're not political, they are for Belize, but they were very clear. Listen, we have had a decade of waste and abuse and corruption. And they feel very strongly about that. They believe that certainly COVID took us over the cliff, but what got us here was that waste and abuse and corruption. When we had an opportunity, when Belize had millions of dollars in Petrocarib funds, when we had oil revenues, hundreds of millions of dollars, when we had a budget every year of over $1 billion, we were not preparing for a rainy day, much less a rainy year. So, they understand, and they don't want us to make those mistakes again. They don't want us to travel that road again. So those are their concerns. And as I said, I view them as being very sincere. And that's the approach we've taken in the consultations, to talk to them about how can we work together to ensure that we don't make those mistakes. Again, what can we put in place? We talked about specific amendments to the law. For example, they have a lot of concerns about what they call double dipping. A lot of individuals who have retired from the public service but have been hired back on contracts. So double dipping. They want to put an end to that, amend the Pensions Act to put an end to that, because it does multiple things. One, these people are paid a lot of money, but also it demoralizes the younger public officers coming up who don't get these opportunities. Allowances, you've heard this already. They want a review of all these allowances that are given across the board, telephone allowances, housing allowances, entertainment allowances. I think, the government already in our last cabinet meeting took a decision to cut the allowances paid to and the stipends, for want of a better word, paid to all board members by 50%.
Not executives though, right? Just members.
No, not executives, right, board members. Outstanding taxes, this is an issue that has come up again. There's some disagreement about the numbers, but there are outstanding taxes in terms of GST, business tax, income tax, property tax. These are all things that we have to address.
Yeah.
The government is committed to doing so.
And
but
still
those
responding
things
in a
take long.
pandemic, of course, to the new needs as they emerge. Now, the question here is, Minister Fonseca, is that the administration, when going into election, knew a lot of what the financial situation is. Maybe not as bad. You wouldn't be able to quantify to 130,000+ deficit, but you knew that it was going to be a serious financial rebound that would have to be worked on. My question is, moving forward, if you, as you put together your budget consultations, as you put together your budget, for the upcoming year, the Ministry of Education is one of the allocations that's the largest. I think it is the largest allocation each year. How do you plan wanting to deliver on all the things that you campaigned on, but also recognizing that there simply is no money?
Yeah, the Ministry of Education is the second largest after the Ministry of Finance, as you would appreciate. No, I mean, you make the point, Marlene, and it's a critically important point. Yes, we knew that the country was in crisis. The Belizean people knew that the country was in crisis. They voted to put an end to the government that they viewed on November 11th as being responsible for that crisis. So we appreciate that, but I don't think people fully appreciate the depth and magnitude of the crisis. And that is what we have been unveiling over the past, I think, 2 months in particular. I mean, as you all know, the former outgoing Prime Minister, I think, was, in a moment of candor, was very, very candid in one of his last press briefings, where he expressed, in my view, very casually, sympathy for those who came after him. As he put it, après moi le déluge, no? After me the floods. Very, very casually, in my view, and recklessly. But nevertheless, that is where we are. The Belizean people gave the government of the Prime Minister John Briceño a very strong mandate for change, a mandate for reform, and that is what we're committed to. But we can't start off our term with hiding the facts. We have to be very straight, very honest, very upfront with both the public officers, the teachers, the private sector, and the Belizean people. We have to be very straight with them about what we have found and explaining to them how do we work together to get out of this situation. So in terms of education, absolutely. Well, what is first important is that the entire cabinet, the Prime Minister, has always expressed the view that education is a priority, a national priority for the People's United Party government. So we can't cut corners when it comes to education. We have to be more efficient. We have to be more effective. But we can't cut corners. We cannot allow the education system to fall behind any more than it has already fallen behind.
So let me use this quick opportunity, Minister, to ask you, since we're at the tail end of the first 100 days, to give us your assessment of the state of education and where your ministry proposes to go forward in the context of the COVID pandemic.
No, we're faced with a crisis, in my view, a crisis in education. I pointed this out before the election. I pointed it out when we presented our education plan, Belize. We are faced with a very serious situation. And the COVID-19 pandemic, as it has done for so many sectors of our country, has exposed these very, very stark weaknesses in our education system. So the most vulnerable students in our country are the ones who are hurting the most, and that is of great concern to me. Our poorer students, or students in rural communities, they're the ones who are falling behind, or students who do not have the support that they need, the proper support, whether it's at home, whether it is because of a lack of technology, whether it's the lack of access to Wi-Fi, general support, they are the ones who are hurting the most. They're the ones who are suffering the most. So we have an absolute obligation and duty to fix this situation. So we're committed to doing that. We talk about moving forward. As you know, we've right away as we got into the Ministry of Education, our focus had to be on how do we begin the process of returning to the classroom, because this situation of remote learning cannot continue. It's unsustainable. It's not working for too many students. So yes, we have to do what we can to make it better while we're in that situation. But our focus has to be on how can we safely and responsibly open schools for face-to-face instruction. And that is what we've been about from day one. And we've appointed, as you all know, a COVID-19 education task force comprised of the major stakeholders in education to do just that, to come up with specific recommendations and guidelines for how we can open responsibly.
And before we go any further with that, because I know that's something that parents are eagerly sitting in front of their TV waiting to hear about, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what's the plan moving forward for the reopening of schools. So please stay tuned.
For over 20 years, Great Belize Television, Channel 5, has been the leader in award-winning local programming. We have also produced some of the best video commercials, documentaries, and live events for clients countrywide. And we continue to offer high-quality production services to maximize your advertising needs for your business or organization. From concept to completion, let us help you achieve your marketing goal by producing your commercial, documentary, graphic animation, live event, or even designing your website. Using state-of-the-art equipment and experienced personnel, we can make your ideas come alive. For more information, come see us on Coney Drive or give us a call at 223-0146 or 223-7781 or email us at gbtv@vtl.net. Great Belize Productions, making great television in Belize.
And we're back. And if you are just joining us, we are continuing with a conversation that we started with Minister Francis Fonseca. We spent quite a bit of time talking about the budget consultations. And now we move, Minister, into what is essentially your area of expertise at this time, and talking about when schools will reopen and what that will look like.
Yeah, well, I think we all want to get back to school, Marlene, in a face-to-face way. As I was saying before the break, I think everyone wants that. You hear some people saying, "Oh, the teachers don't want that," but I can tell you, in my discussions with Belize National Teachers Union, they want it as much as anyone else. They miss their students. The teachers, I think, in absolute good faith, want to get back into the classroom. But like everybody else, they want to do it in a safe and responsible manner. That is our commitment. That is our commitment to the teachers. That is our commitment to the students. That is our commitment to our administrators. And that is our absolute commitment to the parents, that we will do this in a safe and responsible manner. We will at all times be guided by our public health officials. So that is critically important for everyone to understand. We want to take, of course, a phased approach to this because, as I pointed out, I think earlier, there are particular groups that are vulnerable, and I think that are being particularly disadvantaged. So we're looking very clearly at putting in place urgently models for special education students, for example, special needs students, for our IT vet students who need skills training, and they need to get back into their workshops and get their hands on their tools. We need to have a specific plan for getting them back into their classrooms. agricultural students, the Central Farm at the University of Belize, for example. These students need to get back into the fields. They can't, obviously can't learn by remote. So that's critically important. We need to get them back. Our early childhood educators, our students or preschoolers, again, how can we safely and responsibly return them back into their classrooms? As you know, these young ones, these little ones, they thrive on interaction. They thrive on being around their fellow preschoolers. They thrive on being, stimulated by their teachers. We're entering in a few days Child Stimulation Month. So we're talking about that. So that's a critically important area that we have to focus on.
Minister, you speak of a phased approach, but have you been able to come up with a timeline? Because I know that the new school year begins in August, September, and perhaps there are those who are anticipating that presumably by then they would be returning to the classrooms.
Yes, absolutely. Our timeline is for rolling out this phased approach between April and September. So that our objective would be that come September, our hope and objective is that everyone should be back in the classroom come September, the new school year. But we can't wait for September. We have to make sure that we are taking a phased approach to it. And that in fact, as I keep pointing out, that we are addressing these urgent situations that exist. Also, our seniors, high school seniors, they have specific needs in terms of exams and that they have to sit, certain things they have to prepare for. We have to have a plan for that, and that we are working on. Our standard 6 students. So we are very aware of the challenges. As I said, it's not an issue that the Ministry of Education can deal with alone. We have to be guided by the public health officials. And of course, at the end of the day, it is the cabinet that will make a final decision as to whether we can have a formal reopening of schools. But we are doing all the work. I want to assure the Belizean people, I want to assure our parents, or students, or teachers, or administrators that we are preparing, and we're doing it in consultation with them.
What I'm hearing from you, just to be clear, is that it's quite possible that at the start of the 3rd semester for some schools that we will actually see some face-to-face education resume?
Yes, it's possible. It's possible. And one of the things we're doing is we have received, for example, a number of proposals from specific schools. Saying, listen, we have a plan for reopening our school. Review the plan, look at our plan. And if we meet the criteria that you're looking for, then give us the go ahead. And so we have to be flexible. We have to be open to that. And we're prepared to do that. We're saying to schools, individual schools, if you can come up with a plan that meets our criteria, that provides a model for you to reopen safely and responsibly, that takes into consideration all of the concerns that we have, teachers have, administrators have, parents have, then let's look at it and let's try to reopen. So there's no, we're not saying, again, we talked about one size fits all. We're not applying that policy. Where schools can demonstrate that they are ready, that they are prepared, and we are satisfied that they are ready and prepared, then we're prepared to give them the go-ahead to open. But we have to make sure that we're doing that in consultation with all the relevant parties. That's why I make the point that the COVID Education Task Force has representation from Belize National Teachers Union. It has representation from parents. It has representation from mental health awareness groups. It has representation from students and the National Student Union of Belize. Because we want all those parties to be at the table being a part of the discussion so that we can develop a model for reopening schools. That's one based on our collective guidelines and recommendations.
Minister, I know one of the things that we don't discuss as often is looking at the education gap that existed before and what may exist now. Our children are looking at a year out of school, and as I'm sure we can all agree, there were some children who either attended a school that was better prepared for a transition of distance learning, and some who have not been able to get continuous or consistent learning opportunities over the past year. A reality is that you have schools that may reopen and children will be at different levels. What's the plan in being able to have that catch-up time? And also, how do you not build on the disparity? If you move to face-to-face reopening with, let's say, private schools who are already probably better financed to retrofit the spaces or to allow for a reopening on schedule, it'll be very different from a rural school that you spoke of where there are disadvantages, or in schools where the parents don't have the type of finances to invest in the school.
Yeah, that's a critically important point, Marlene. You're absolutely right. And we're doing a lot of work in that regard. During this period, a lot of assessment has been done of the online education, the remote learning that has taken place. There's a dedicated team in the Ministry of Education that's looking at this very issue that you're talking about. What lessons have we learned from this experience of remote learning, and what impact has it had? What impact in a data-driven way? What impact has it had on specific populations of students? You can't plan for education if you don't have the data, if you don't do the proper analysis and assessment. So it starts with analysis, it starts with assessment. We have done a lot of that, but there needs to be more done. Once we have that, then you can plan properly for how you move forward. How do you address this growing gap? As you rightly point out, certainly in my view, and I think in the view of many other Belizeans, education was already in crisis before COVID came along. Too many of our young people were not moving from primary school to secondary school. In terms of our results, in terms of national examinations, I think it was clear to many people that we were falling behind. The school enrollment, shockingly, the school enrollment was falling. So we were faced with serious problems. And as we pointed out earlier, the Belizean people are spending close to $300 million every year on education. And it's become rhetoric now, but we're not getting value for money. We're not getting value for money. Though we have to address that issue, and we have to focus on three things, in my view: access, equity, and quality. First of all, students need to have access to education. If you don't have access, then nothing else will matter. So we have to make sure that our students in remote communities, in rural communities, have access to quality education. So access is critical. Equity, you talked about equity just now. Yes, we have to ensure that we are providing our students with an equitable education. So wherever they live in this country, they should have access to quality teachers. And that brings you to quality of education. How can we ensure that our teachers are properly qualified, that they're delivering quality education? How can we ensure that the curriculum is relevant to the needs, the development needs of our country? How can we make sure that we're not overburdening our young people with the curriculum we now have? And I can tell you, we've set up another team that's looking specifically at that issue. And Minister Louis Zavenet, Dr. Louis Zavenet, is particularly focused on that issue, holding discussions with our teams within the ministry at quads and on other areas, to focus on the curriculum. How can we address that issue? So access, quality, equity are critical components of how we move forward in terms of education.
What about fulfilling the campaign promise? And if I could probe a bit further, you went into the last election talking about free education for all. This is, of course, a very popular thing to say, but very difficult to roll out. And also may not necessarily meet objectives of what you talk about, equitable access, where someone can afford to go to school, money not spent on tuition is then spent on additional reinforcement. So let's put that into perspective, whether it's practical, and especially given the current situation, and whether it actually allows for equitable access for all.
Yeah, I think in terms of rolling out, as you know, it's a 5-year plan. So it's not going to be done in 3 months, and it's certainly not going to be done in 1 year. But we are taking steps to deliver on these specific commitments. I can tell you we have already, for example, the Ministry of Education developed our policy plan on a rural education fund, on a higher education fund. We're developing our policy paper on a teacher learning institute. So all of these things we're working on. Curriculum reform that I talked about earlier, the restructuring of the Ministry of Education, that is something we've spent a lot of time on as well. How can we make the Ministry of Education more efficient, more effective in the delivery of the services that we provide to the Belizean people? We talked, of course, we had to address on day one the COVID situation. How do we get back to school? That is our number one objective. So we set up, as we committed to in our education plan, this COVID-19 education task force to do just that. So we are focused on those things and making sure, but of course it will have to be in a phased approach. So if we had in our education plan, for example, setting up a $3 million rural education fund, we will have to scale that down in year one and perhaps roll out $1 million rural education fund. And then as the economy recovers and the fiscal position improves, we can expand it to ensure that we are providing more funds for the rural communities. So I think that is critically important. In terms of, I think you raised the other issue. Maybe I'm missing the last point you made, Marlene.
The free, well, it's still free education,
yes,
and
correct.
ensuring that.
Correct. Yeah. I think we've had that debate, and we feel very, very firm in our position and very comfortable in our position that this is a policy that is equitable. Education is a human right, and so we have to provide, and we're talking about preschool to sixth form. We have to provide education for people, and we think it is a necessary investment. When we talk about inequity, or people who can afford, and so, but generally those people who can afford are putting back monies into the government coffers anyway, in terms of paying higher taxes. Perhaps they have more spending power, so they're putting more money back into the economy. So I think when you look at it on a whole, we believe that policy is absolutely achievable. We believe it's equitable. And it's, you talked about, we've done, we did a lot of work on this. Even when the last time I was the Minister of Education, we had begun working on this issue. So we did a lot of work on this issue, and we believe even with our current budget for education, it can be achieved. It can be achieved with minimal, I think minimal increases. It can be achieved over a 5-year period, but it certainly is not something that we can achieve in this fiscal year, given the financial situation of the country.
Now, looking at, and I'm glad you mentioned it, you have been in charge of this portfolio before, and it's been, over a decade since you had left the ministry. What are some of and things have changed significantly in how children learn and what we know about how children learn, about even the priority areas for the country. Let's, for one moment, and I know it's something that we probably should never do, put the financial constraints aside and tell us what your vision is about being able to move what direction you want to move education in Belize.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we could have come into office with a robust economy and just hit the ground running, because we have so many plans for education, for culture, for science and technology. But if all else were equal, Marlene, Sani, our focus, as you rightly said, has to be on the new models for education. At the forefront of that has to be technology. Our young people today learn in a different way. They are stimulated visually. So we need to create modern spaces for learning, spaces that stimulate young people's minds. So even the way, I came into office and inherited a project to build schools across the country. Millions of dollars being spent on building schools. And I wish, we would have had the opportunity to reshape that in a significant way. Because even school buildings have to look different. The inside, it's no longer about blackboards and all these things. We need technology. We need technology in our classrooms. Young people, as my friend Yasser Musa likes to remind me, young people, for them, the internet and technology is like water. They need to be drinking it all day long. So technology has to be at the forefront of our education agenda. How do we make technology more available to our young people? How do we use technology to deliver education more effectively, more efficiently? And then, of course, IT vets, skills training, critically important. How do we make sure that, as I pointed out earlier, these are priority areas for me. How do we make sure our students are being equipped with the skills that they need to function in the Belizean economy, to get work, to find jobs, to provide, to create their own employment? Critically important in terms of IT vet. Special education, another passion for me. How do we make sure that these young people with special needs, that they are not left behind, that we equip them with the tools they need, the skills they need, the attitude, the values they need to properly function in our society, independently, with dignity. Those are all critical areas for me. And we could go on. Early childhood education.
And even, I know your portfolio includes science and technology. We didn't get to touch too much on it, but you noted that technology needs to be integrated in education. Some countries have moved towards introducing things like coding from a very young age, because that is part of the language of the future. But moving away from the receivers of the education plans to those who execute. The teachers have had, they're very vocal union, and they have been very much, I would say, assertive in speaking about some of the challenges that they've had. We saw the challenges with the last administration. How do you view that relationship? It's clear that we can talk about qualification and certification, but it's also a challenge when you think of what teachers are asked to face with oversized classroom, under-resourced classrooms, and also having the management also as a part of the player in how education is rolled out.
Yeah, very, very important point, Marlene. And I think that's a very, the teachers union, and I share that view. I think the last administration in the Ministry of Education was too focused on administrative control, too focused on teacher licenses. Yes, we need regulation. But our administration, our Ministry of Education will be focused on student learning, student outcomes, the learning outcomes of our students. That has to be our focus. And integrally tied to that is, of course, teachers. We won't have good student learning outcome if we don't have good quality teachers, and if our teachers are not put in a position where they can properly and effectively deliver education. So I really, I think we have an opportunity to walk a new path with the Belize National Teachers Union. I've met with them as Minister of Education. We've also met during the budget consultations. We will meet again very shortly. But I certainly have reached out to them and made it very clear to them that I want us to establish a new working partnership and relationship because we are in this together. We cannot succeed one without the other. We need to work together. The students of our country, the teachers of our country, the parents of our country are depending on us working together, having a shared common obligation and duty to quality education. Now, we won't always agree on every issue, but as I said, they can certainly depend on me not to make it personal. We will have differences of opinion on how we approach different problems and challenges in education, but I am absolutely committed to a working, respectful partnership with the Belize National Teachers Union, and indeed with all our other partners in education, particularly now as we are faced with this very serious crisis in education. How do we get back to school in a safe and responsible way?
We've heard kind of casually that there's a consideration for vaccinating teachers as a part of the early rollout. Was this a recommendation that you made, and what's your stance on this?
Yeah, absolutely. The recommendation came from above me, actually, and I, of course, fully supported and endorsed it. But the Prime Minister made it very clear in our last cabinet meeting where we discussed the phased rollout of the vaccine, COVID vaccine, that teachers should and would be included in phase one of that rollout. So we have about 6,000 teachers, and that is the objective, that as soon as we get our first batch of the vaccine, we are hoping that that will be sometime in March, and that thereafter, I think the ministry has said they will have a plan for rolling out the vaccine. We are very, very hopeful about that because that will assist us as well in terms of the safe reopening of schools. Yeah. With schools, of course, you have to appreciate, and I want people to understand this, that it's not just about the young people going to school. For the most part, we all know young people are not at great risk when it comes to COVID. Yeah. But we have a lot of teachers who have underlying conditions. Yeah. We have some elderly teachers, but also keep in mind that our young people and these teachers are going home. So it's not just something we can look at through the lens of our education system. We also have to look at it through the wider lens of our public health officials. Yeah. These people, teachers and students, are going back home. Many cases, as you all know, our young people live with grandparents. They live with guardians who are old. We have to be sensitive to that. We have to appreciate that. So these are decisions that have to be carefully made, responsibly made. Yeah. And I want the Belizean people to know that our government and the Ministry of Education is firmly committed to doing things responsibly and safely.
And before we close off our conversation, while we've been very focused on your individual portfolios, let's broaden the conversation and talk about your administration. And as you head into the presentation of the budget and the start of a new financial year, it's over 100 days in office. It's always a critical time how you hit the ground running. What's your assessment as to how the administration has done? If you were to grade yourself as Minister of Education, what grade would you give yourself?
Oh no, we have a long way to go. Probably a Ministry of Education, probably a C. We have a long way to go.
To the entire administration?
No. I said the Ministry of Education. We have a long way to go. The people who work with me on a daily basis can tell you that I'm our harshest critic. I'm frustrated when I can't get things done. And every week I have my specific goals and objectives that I want to get done. And when those are not achieved, I am frustrated. So we have a long way to go. We're just getting started. In terms of the overall administration, I would say, I would say a B. We've come into office with unprecedented crises facing us in terms of the COVID pandemic, the floods that devastated many communities. It's just a serious situation. I don't think any government has come into office since independence faced with such crises. But despite that, I am very optimistic. I'm very hopeful. I'm very proud to be a part of this cabinet. I think it's a very competent cabinet. People who I see their passion on a daily basis, their commitment to the country, their commitment to those they represent on a daily basis, in agriculture, in tourism, in rural development, and infrastructure. Despite the very harsh financial situation, I think the government is trying to prioritize the needs of the Belizean people. So I am very hopeful, and I am absolutely confident that this government will deliver for the Belizean people. It's been a rough start because of the economic situation, but we will get this right. We will fix the economy, and we will get back on track. And of course, it's frustrating when you can't, people can't get jobs. They've been, wanting and waiting and hoping for jobs. They can't get jobs. They can't get access to housing. Those are critical issues for them. But we do the best we can. And certainly in education, we try every day to provide support to needy families. That has to be our priority. And I think that's one lesson we have to learn of coming out of this crisis, is that we have to focus our attention on the needy and those who need most, and trying to make sure that they do not fall further behind. So I'm very hopeful, Marlene and Isani. I'm very hopeful, I'm very confident, I'm very optimistic about the future. But I think what we are asking the Belizean people is, listen, you came out in almost unprecedented numbers on November 11th to support John Briceño and the People's United Party government. Your job was not finished on November 11th. We need your support more than ever now. We need you to walk this journey with us so that we can deliver for the Belizean people, so that we can deliver jobs. We can deliver land. The Minister of Lands, the Deputy Prime Minister, I think, is doing everything he can to get lands into the hands of those who need them most. First-time landowners, critically important. So we need to work together, and we need the support of the Belizean people. We've only been in office 3 months. We need you to walk with us on this journey. Your job was not done on November 11th. You need to walk with us, hold us accountable, but guide us and help us, support us to get this job done, because we are absolutely committed to getting it right and delivering for the Belizean people.
And with the mandate delivered on November 11th, how are you feeling about March 3rd, whether that's going to be a kind of grade that will be dished out to the administration as well?
Yeah, I think we feel very good about March 3rd. I think we feel, I think the Belizean people, for the most part, understand that we've only been in office 3 months. They understand the financial situation, crisis we're faced with. And they understand that, in many of these communities, for example, in Belize City, where I'm most familiar with, the mayor and his team in Belize City, I think despite, having no support from central government, the UDP central government from March of 2018 to November of 2020, managed to deliver the basic services for the Belizean people, did not terminate anybody from the office, from the city council. And there's an opportunity for them as we move forward and the economy improves over the next 3 years, for them to get more meaningful support from a PUP central government. So together, as they say, together we can. So we are committed to working with them. And we believe they deserve an opportunity to work with the PUP central government to deliver for the residents of Belize City. And that applies to municipalities across the country.
Yeah. Well, Honorable Fonseca, thank you very much for joining us this morning and being able to talk a bit about how the budget preparation and consultations are going and what the short-term and long-term plans are for education in Belize. Stay safe.
Sure. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Isani. My pleasure. I look forward to speaking with you all again. Stay safe.
And with that, we are going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking, or we're going to try to get some more understanding as to what long-haul COVID is like, why people get these symptoms, what type of symptoms they're facing. That's coming up after the break. Please stay tuned.
This COVID update was brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.